Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1316. Aleph Shinta Zayin. And we've entered into a discussion of the meaning of the narrative, the episode in the Torah, what is called the episode of the bitter waters. Vayove Marasa, where the Jews encountered the waters that were bitter, they could not drink. And God showed Moshe wood, which then was thrown into the water. Bitter wood, as the Medrash says, that no matter what opinion, it was eitz mar, it was a bitter piece of wood. And it sweetened the waters, and as he explained very clearly, this wasn't an outside sweetener. It was the bitterness itself became transformed into sweetness, which of course is in context of what we've been discussing of when light enters into darkness, so it can dissipate and dispel the darkness, or on a deeper level, it transforms the darkness. And that itself, we learned there are two ways. It can be transformed through light. On page 11, 13, 15, he said, or that light, the darkness itself becomes light. This will be understood much better as we continue learning about it. But this is a topic that goes back to the central theme of Ayin Beis. So I wanted to just say a few words about that, which is the interface between divine and existence, between transcendence and immanence. And in the 1,300 and some pages we've been learning, the Rebel Hashab has laid it out in elaborate detail, the different aspects of the interface, from the beginning of the Hemshech all the way through to where we are now. A big part of it, beginning especially in the middle of volume 2, was about how you deal with an interface between a post-symptom reality and a pre-symptom consciousness, or a post-symptom consciousness and a pre-symptom reality. And the ultimate answer was that you need to transform the tzimtzum. And with that, he began a whole discussion of Vayedaita Hayim, Vashavesa Levavecha, Ki Havayu Elikim, B'Shamayim Emal V'Oretz Metachas Ein Oid. So a long discussion that ensued up till volume 3 was the Havayu Elikim element, that even the Elikim of tzimtzum, that too should be transformed, and the light of Havaya should shine through it. So you have a seamlessness from the divine through the concealment that creates existence. However, that's still Havayu Elikim. It's Elikim associating with Havaya. Then there's the level of Havaya itself radiating. The concealment itself radiates. That's a whole different story. That's not just as it associates, like you kept on saying, especially lately, broadening the boundaries or the territory and domain of light, of godly revelation, but that there's something in the very concealment, or in the language we're using now, in the very bitterness, that becomes sweet. So it's not just overpowered by sweetness or eliminated by sweetness, but it's actually something is transformed from within itself, which ultimately is the ultimate redemption, that every part of existence, even the very concealment, even 1 second of aggravation that the concealment created, will also be transformed, which is all part of the Ein Oid, the last 2 words in the verse, after Havayu Elikim. And that began volume 3, and he's been contrasting it. As a matter of fact, just on page 13, 15, he literally cited it all. He went back to Yuchad Havayu Elikim from back in volume 2, and then said, but the goal is Shem Elikim Atzmei Yoir. That's Isapche Chashech Neher. So the truth is, you can call transforming the darkness, that light transforms darkness, and the darkness is now shining with the light. But he wants more than that. He wants a transformation from within itself, which is on a far deeper level. But they are interconnected, as we learned at length, because you have to go through the bitter netzutzes of going through the dark world and first radiating and illuminating it with oir. And as we continue the process, we ultimately come to the final frontier, the final step of that total transformation that we're into right now. So the last thing we learned was that in the sweetening of the water, we're talking about this, the bitter itself is becoming sweet. But to explain this, Rebel Hashab steps back and says, in truth, there's 2 ways to sweeten Gvura. And right now, for the next page and a half, he's going to talk about the first way. And then on page 13, 17, in the new paragraph, Omnom, he's going to go to the second. And then he's going to teach us a third, and maybe even a fourth. We'll see. But right now, the first way, which we began learning, is that the Gevuras are nimtokim b'chsadim. They're not sweetened by themselves. They're sweetened by the chsadim, and he gave the 2 examples, both from physical examples, one liquid and one solid, if you wish. One is when you mix sweet waters into bitter waters. If it's abundant enough, it will essentially nullify the bitterness. That when there's enough sweet and beautiful, or he says yofim, we said we could say healthy waters, refreshing, nourishing waters, it will overpower and nullify the other, and everything will become sweet. However, there's 2 things that have not happened. Number one is it's not the same as pure sweetness on its own. It's not like sweetness, like pure sweet waters that don't have any bitter waters in it. And also that the mayim hamasukim, the sweet waters, get diluted and weakened from their pure, pristine form due to the fact that there is some bitter water in there. Even if you feel it or you don't feel it, but it's not. Those are the 2 things. The second example, Kamoya Mesikrus, the son and the dvash, what we call glazed radishes, or honey glazed radishes, which so he says the Mesikrus achrifus, where you're sweetening the sharpness, or another word for there's we said bitter, there's sharp, and there's another word you could use. Chifus is usually sharp. It's sour, but sour is a different word. He's not using that word here. So, so even though the tam hachorev, the sharpness of the radish, has been transformed to something sweet, you can't say the radish that was bitter has now become, or sharp, has now become not sharp. It's just sweet to the mouth because the honey has either nullified it or has directed it. Because the very bitter waters or sharp radish, they did not fundamentally change. I mean, you can even wipe off if you can get the glaze off, the radish can go back to the way it was. He doesn't say that, but I'm saying just as an example. It's hard to do with water, to remove the sweet water. But conceptually, you have not changed fundamentally the bitterness or the sharpness of that personality of that particular object or item. Because fundamentally, it's either bitter or sharp. Something else sweetened it. And then he brought a dish. I'm just summing up what we learned. The mesikus hatzonin ein mitzad atzmei klal ve'ein shini be'etzem ha'mechel amar rak shenimshach v'hurkav b'ei mitam ha'mesikus. It's only that the sweetness has entered that dish and has been mixed with it, but it's not fundamentally changed it. And just as the sharp radish, by cooking it, he says bishul, by cooking it with something sweet like honey, so it assumes that sweetness. The same thing the other way around. Kach kibul hadvash, so too the honey that is being cooked there, it also assumes and absorbs the taste of the sharp radish that gets mixed together through this cooking. And now you have a mixture of 2 tastes. Even if the dominant one is sweet, but it's 2 tastes, V'hu tama kiyua. That's where we brought the kiyua. So as was pointed out, kiyua is used in the Gemara for fruit vinegar. So vinegar, we know, is sour or bitter. Fruit is sweet, and you mix them together. It's a drink. I looked it up a little more in depth. The Rashi teaches there kiyua and Shabbos Daf Kuf Yud Aleph that it's unripened fruit. So is that fruit vinegar or not? I don't know. But it doesn't translate as fruit vinegar, it translates as unripened fruit. And but kiyua usually seems to be here, at least, that it's some type of food. There, he talks about it in a way that's actually can cause problems, digestive problems. That's what's discussed there. But the way he's using kiyua here, and I know in other places of Chassidus, it could be used like a dish that has so fruit vinegar would actually be a very appropriate example, as would be like the glazed radishes, the honey glazed radishes is also a form of mixing the two. So maybe it needs a little more iyun, a little more looking into it, but the idea is pretty clear. And I think when you go with that approach, as I said, fruit vinegar is a perfect example, but there could be other dishes that the Rebel Hashab may be referring to, which, as again, I need to look a little more into it. How Chassidus brings kiyua. And that's where we stopped. So bottom line is, what do we have? We definitely have something that's not just plain bitter, something that's been sweetened, something that's not just plain sharp, it's also been sweetened, but the sweetening has not fundamentally changed the thing that's bitter or sharp. And each of them assumes the other, and it's not pure sweetness and not pure sharpness, but it's definitely not the full transformation. But he's going to continue to discuss this further, as I said, at least another page until the next bottom of the next page, all about Eifana Aleph of how Hamtokes Hagvuras, but B'chsodim. So these are all examples, and he's, I'm sure, going to go back to the moral, which is severities and kindness, and chesed and kindness, how kindness dilutes or sweetens the severities. The Rebel Hashab continues now. I'm going to learn further. It's around close to half down the page. The line begins Hakiyua, and we're going to start from the word V'yesh Kama Ifanim. Those that want to follow the text that you don't have, if you don't have the text, go to ayinbeis.com. The PDF of these texts are all there. So now he says, V'yesh Kama Ifanim B'misikus Ke'ela. And there are a number of ways in this type of sweetening. It's not just a one black and white mixture. There are different ways that this mixture can take place and how this sweetening takes place. As we know, I mean, just look, we can sweeten coffee, we can sweeten radishes, we can sweeten vinegar. I mean, so there's a kame fanim, he says, b'mesikas ke'ela, but all of them go under one rubric, one category. But they are all, and they are all only mashakoyach echad machlish l'koyach shekenegdei. So Rebel Hashab, in dissecting and trying to get to the core of the issue, he's adding now another form of expressing it. That one power, one strength, or one taste has weakened or diluted l'koyach shekenegdei to its opposite. So sweetness has weakened the bitterness, or sweetness has weakened the sharpness. That's how it's called. So machlish l'koyach shekenegdei, which again, he used that word before, machlish. It weakens it to the point that could even be dominant. Ubechlal, and in general, this is called nikra misuk hagvuras b'chsadim. This is called the sweetening of the severities within the chsadim. In other words, here you have severities of judgment, of gvura. You put that into chsadim, or you put the chsadim into gvuras, just like you would take bitter water and you'd put it into sweet water. So that's called sweetening the gvuras. Misuk Hagvura is b'chsadim. Be'efen kazeh, in such a manner, sha'amtoke bo mekayach achsadim. In such a manner that the sweetness comes from the power of the kindness of the chsadim. Hamanagde, that opposes severities. Shamachlish kayach hagvura. 1 second. That in this manner, that it sweetens it, the opposite, by weakening the power of the severity of the gvura. This is not called fundamentally changing the judgment and the severity. The only thing you could say is that it gets sweetened by the power of chesed, of kindness, that dominates over it, that overpowers it. That's what you can say. I'm sure he's going to use examples, but I'll just say, for example, if a defense attorney wins the case over the prosecutor, that doesn't mean the prosecutor, obviously he has to accept the verdict, but it doesn't mean he changed his position. He may still think the person is guilty, but in this case, the evidence and the witnesses and all the different elements have won over that the chesed has dominated over the gvura, so it's sweetened the gvura. Or, for example, let's say you're about to sentence someone who's been found guilty to a sentence. And then someone stands up and defends him and says, let's mitigate, let's weaken the sentence. Instead of sitting in prison for a year, sit for 2 months. So what did you do? You didn't change the gvura, you weakened it. You made it less, you lessened it. I'm just giving a few examples. That's not total transformation of it. If indeed, for example, you reverse the whole process and he doesn't sit at all, like with the story of the Friedrich Rebbe, instead of a death sentence and instead of exile, he was completely freed. Again, we're not talking about whether the enemy became a friend. That's another story. But at least the gvura is no longer, is that total transformation? Probably also not. But at least it's not just the weakening of the gvura that he's speaking about now. And so too similarly is b'koyach haseichel hamata klapedin v'chev. So he's now going back to the case of, let's say, judgment. You're sitting in judgment. The koyach haseichel. We're not talking about the midah of gvura now. The midah of gvura is an actual emotional and applied faculty that you actually feel there's judgment. But the seichel is when there's still deliberation among the judges and they're deliberating. But the koyach haseichel hamata klapedin v'chev. The seichel can be leaning and inclining toward din v'chev, which means guilt and dismerit, in judgment and chev, and that is responsible, he's guilty. V'chein midas hadin v'hareges shebelev. So just as the koyach haseichel, there's also the midas. You have the midas hadin v'hareges, judgment or severity, and even reges is anger or wrath. Shebelev in the heart. So he says, so when a person, let's say, has their mind is leaning toward saying that this person, that this situation is off limits or something is guilty, doesn't necessarily talk about a person. The situation is leaning toward, like, let's say someone offers you a business deal, and after research, your mind is leaning against it because you don't feel it's going to work, it's going to fail, or it has flaws and so on. And in the heart, and the same thing in the heart, there's a feeling of judgment and basically being repelled, if you wish. Reges means anger or wrath, but it could also be being repelled. It's like you're not neutral. You're leaning against the reges means shebelev shenech. So all this, he says, when it comes chesed comes into the picture, shenechlas keiche v'nimtik. So then there's also, let's say somebody, or even in your own mind, there's another theory Your mind is telling you that a theory that inclines toward the opposite, that this thing is good. This is a thing worth engaging in, or the person is not guilty. Person is meritorious. Zakai. So it could be either another person who's making that argument, or even in your own mind. You have a theory like this, you have a theory like that. He doesn't really distinguish between the two. So he says, so the mind that's inclining toward Gvura and Din gets weakened by the mind, or you could say the theory, the idea, the argument that leans toward Chesed, and then the Gover al Koyach Hadin, and that is overpowers and stronger over the Koyach, the power of judgment, Umamtikai, and it sweetens it, Kamoi Achre Rabim Lahatis, like we see in a Bezdin, where it says in the Posuk, Mishpatim, it says that when you have, let's say, a Bezdin of 3 or a Bezdin of 71, doesn't matter. That it says, the Torah says you go by the majority, the consensus. So here you'll have, let's say, one judge is arguing Din and Gvura, the other two make a case for Chesed. What happens? The Chesed wins, because 2 against 1, Achre Rabim Lahatis. That doesn't mean the Gvura was eliminated. It means it was overwhelmed, was overridden by the Chesed. So the argument that the Seichel, that Mata toward Chesed, overpowered the Seichel, the theory that was inclining toward Gvura. Achre Rabim Lahatis. This is nothing but the sweetening of the Gvura Chsadim that are sweet. The Gvuras did not change fundamentally. That's a mahusam. So it's only the sweetening due to the powerful overpowering of the Chsadim. Literally, like we said before about sweet waters, diluting or weakening the bitter ones. So it doesn't eliminate it. It didn't transform it fundamentally. It dominates over because there's more of it. So they were sweetened and weakened through the power of Chsadim. I'm going to finish till the end of the paragraph, then I'll take some questions. Now, he didn't redress the din v'regis shebelev, but he did say that too gets weakened, obviously. So even if a person has in their heart, let's say you feel about a certain individual or a certain situation, you're repelled by it because whatever the case is made, you feel really it's something that deserves anger or wrath. So the power of Chsadim could persuade you not to follow your feelings, but not because you fundamentally change them, but because there's an overpowering element here that's stronger. Again, he doesn't spell out exactly the details, but he's going to spell it out now in Aveda with the Nefesh Habamis. Maybe that's the connection. V'chein hamidah ra with the Nefesh Habamis. And so too, when we're talking about amidah ra, a bad quality, a person has a stinginess, a selfishness, any midah ra of the animal soul. Okay? B'islavus eish zara b'yeser. And that midah ra is not just a weakened one. It's burning with a flame, a strange flame. Eish zara is always the expression used when it's foreign fire. In other words, it's a fire not of Kedusha, the opposite. It's a passion in an area that is animal soul, a midah ra. Like people who are very angry and rage, and they're hislavus, with a passion, a fiery rage, for example. It could also be fiery jealousy. It could be fiery cruelty. I mean, different midas ras, and it's burning with a fire, a zara, a foreign or alien fire, b'yeser, increasingly so. Oy b'midas hakas. Okay, I just use anger for this. So clearly he means here just a midah ra. That's a fiery emotion. Oy b'midas hakas. Or with the faculty or the midah, the feeling of anger. The ritzicha literally means murder, but it means like a murderous passion that you have. Doesn't necessarily mean you're murdering someone, but it's definitely leaning in that direction. The gezel, and talking all the worst possible midas here. Litzicha, murder, gezel is theft, ukahai gavna, or similarly. So these are all from the worst midas of the nefesh habamis, and they're raging with a passion. A person has a murderous passion, ready to kill someone. So he says now, kasher yakuf levave. When he's able to overpower, yakuf means to subdue, from the word iskafia, like yakuf, to subdue, to overpower, to control, levave, his heart. V'yachlish koyach hara. And he weakens this evil power, this evil inclination or evil shaboy within him. Through the overpowering element of a divine love. To the point, Yivayir from the word biur, he burns out, he completely annihilates this strange or alien desire from Eish Zora, from this strange and alien fire that's burning in him. So here, a moment before, he was with a fiery anger or fiery other negative emotion, and the love, it doesn't say divine soul, but it looks like Ava Lakus. The love toward godliness overpowers it. The Yumta Karabatev, and this Ra, that could have gone in a very unhealthy and very destructive direction, has now been sweetened within the goodness of the love for God, to the point that its power has subsided very intensely, very much so, subsided or weakened. Zeu shanikra misuk gvuris hakoshes the klipas nega b'chsodim degdusha the nefesh alikis. This is what's called the sweetening of the severities, of the harsh severities or judgments from klipas nega. He's not even talking about shalosh klipas atmeis, even though you would think ritzicha gezel goes in the category of shalosh klipas atmeis. But I think since he's talking about the midas reis of the animal soul, it's like he says in Tanya, the end of chapter 1 and chapter 7, that the negative emotion of the animal soul is still klipas nega in a Jew. It's not shalosh klipas atmeis. Why he associates it then with ritzicha and gezel? If he saw the Daled you say the saroim, so kas he brings. He also brings arrogance. He brings laziness, depression, tivus, desires. But here he brings ritzicha and kas. So I'm not positive how that fits into klipas nega. But I think because he's not talking about necessarily the ritzicha itself. He's talking about the midah in the nefesh habamis that is inclined in that direction. So he's calling it the harsh gvuris of klipas nega being sweetened in what? What's sweetening them? Within the chsadim, the gedusha, the nefesh alikis, within the holy kindness and love and goodness of the divine soul. And this is what we call v'hu anikra iskafia. This is called iskafia, not ishapcha. You haven't transformed, you've subdued, you've controlled, you have dominated over. Okay, so the Rebel Hashab, the end of this paragraph, has summed up what means the first eifin of Amtokas HaGvuras B'chsadim. The main thing is the chesed is the one that is doing the sweetening. What it has is the power to weaken, subdue, very much subdue, tame, if you wish, the gvuras, whether the example in the physical example of water or the kiyur, the dish, sweetened food, sweetened bitterness, and the sweetness of bitter or sharp food. In Ruchnius, in Keiches HaNefesh, he spoke about one faculty, the chesed dominating over the gvura. And finally, he spoke about how it is, even in the Avodah with the Ra of the Nefesh Habamis, that you can subdue it, and you can tame it, and you can control it. But it's still all iskafi, it's a control of one force dominating over another force. Definitely not that the gvura itself was transformed, which he's now going to continue to explain. But since the end of a paragraph here, let's stop here, pause here if anybody wants to ask anything or clarify. Okay, so let's roll right on. Let's move along. All this that we just spoke about is nothing but, and remember, nothing but is a strong statement. It doesn't mean it's nothing. It's a pretty strong thing if a person can control themselves in this way. But compared to what the ultimate, he's calling it ein ze rak. So don't, like before he said that even the Aveda is also, even the Aveda of Gvul the Gedusha is also Madrega Gevay V'nayel Ma'id. So let's not minimize this. It's just, again, when you go to the ultimate transformation, as he's going to explain, he's calling it Ein Zerak Chlishus Keyachara. It's the weakening of the negative power or force. V'lo yinyan bittel v'hepach be'etzem uhusei. But not an elimination and a transformation in the fundamental nature and personality of the Ra. Kemoyes berah. I'm not sure. Kemoyes berah is probably the higher level, where he completely despises an evil. Yeah. Like we find by Tzaddikim Gemurim in Tanya. He's going to come back to the Tanya that we learned and referred to earlier on page 15, sorry. 13:15. So there's the level Tzaddik Gomer that is completely moyes berah. He despises it. Literally like something that is as despicable as possible. That means that is completely, that's a bittul. I don't know if he means that transforms it, but we did learn that Sadiq does transform, if you recall. That only tzaddikim and true Bali Tshuva, he said, there's the transformation of Chashech al Nehera. But we'll learn about this more later. So he says, so this is just the weakening, not the elimination. And Hepach be'etzem hipuch probably means transformation on the fundamental. Kamoyes bara, like someone who absolutely despises Ra. What we spoke about is not necessarily despising Ra. It means that the case to be made from the Av of the Nefesh of the kiss, from the divine love, is more powerful. The sweeter the waters are, the sweet waters are more powerful than the bitter ones, and therefore it tames and subdues the animal part. But it's not kamayis bara. And he's going to explain this now more detail. Even the service of tzaddikim, we're not even talking about beinanim now. A beini for sure is not moyes bara. A beini controls his thought, speech, and action. But he's going further here. Even a tzaddik, who in Perek Yud and Tanya says, who eliminated his Yetzer Hara, a beinani still has an animal soul, but the animal soul is not active in speech, in thought, speech, and action. By a tzaddik, he's eliminated the animal soul. So he says, even the tzaddikim, the bederach klal who are bittul be'etzem ha'mahuz the nefesh habamis. In general, a tzaddik is the bittul, is the elimination of the very personality of the animal soul. And like he explains, the zeh klolos ha'efresh, this is the general difference, like he explains in Tanya. We're talking about Tanya chapter 10 and 12 specifically, that this is the general difference between tzaddikim and beinanim, between the tzaddikim and beinanim. In Tanya, the tzaddikim, the highest level, beinanim is the intermediate. The avedus ha-beinim hu ha-bitl rak b'ispashtus the nefesh habamis. By the service of beinanim, the bitl is only the elimination of the extension of the animal soul. He actually used that earlier as well. The ispashtus shaloi on the fifth line on the previous page, meaning in its expression, in its extension through thought, speech, and action. Avedus ha-tzaddikim, on the other hand, who are bitl be'etzem ha'mahuz the nefesh habamis. The tzaddikim have actually impacted that the faculties of the animal soul have been rendered null and void. Like he says in Tanya, chapters 10 and 12. 10 is about the tzaddik, the tzaddikim, and 12 about the beinim. Nevertheless, in tzaddikim itself, there's also two levels, like he explains in chapter 10. Makol mokim, he says. Nevertheless, even though the tzaddik in general, compared to the beini, eliminates the very personality of the animal soul, not just weakens it, and not just subdues it in its expression of thought, speech, and action, the level of a tzaddik that's not a complete tzaddik, Hurak b'bchinas miyut hara. It explains in Tanya, it's only the diminishment of Ra. Lo shekalo v'holach le'legamri. Not like it's disappeared and completely left him. Rak shebatel b'miyute. It's batel, it's nullified, being that it's so diminished. So it's like nullified, like he says, batel b'shishim b'meya. So it's so minimal, it's nullified in the presence of all the good. So you'll say, oh, if that's the case, what's the difference between him and a Beinani? A Beinani is also, we said before, gets weakened and subdued. In a Beinani, the keiches of the Nefesh Abam is at full strength. You're just not letting them affect your thought, speech, and action. In a tzaddik, even a tzaddik she'eina gamor, the divine soul's very personality, its very faculties have been weakened, but not completely eliminated. They're diminished to the point that they're like bottled. They're, like he says.
You mean the animal soul? You said the divine soul.
The animal soul, yeah, the animal soul. The hainu, and he explains the hainu. This means sharahu b'bchinas miyut, that the ra, meaning any of the negative elements of an animal soul, are in a diminished state. That's the exact language he uses there in Tanya. It's bottle, it's nullified. The kofuf means like it's bowing to or leaning toward or dominated by elatev, toward the good. So the good is dominant. Right. Like he says, he writes in Tanya chapter 10. It's like in halacha where something is some speck of let's say meat in a pot that's 60 times more, something not kosher, let's say in a pot that's 60 times more kosher. Or there's sometimes even a bigger bittul, 1,000, 1 to 1,000. Shekol zeh, no matter what level it is, and there's different levels of bittul, of nullification, hurak is gabrus b'chinas atev. In all these instances, it's the domination and the overpowering of the good, not the complete elimination of the negative. Even by a tzaddik, she'ena gomer. A tzaddik gomer is not that way. He explains in Tanya, in chapter 10. So what do you see? That I feel about Vedas Sadiqim, you have also an element where it's still overpowering and not full transformation or full elimination even. Shekol zeh hurak is gabrus b'chinas hatev. All this is due to the dominance of the tev. Okay, now comes a parenthesis, trying to see where it goes till. Oh, it doesn't look like it's a short one. The parentheses, there's a parenthesis within the parentheses. Oh, this parenthesis looks like it goes all the way to 6 lines of the end of the paragraph in the next page. Oh boy. Okay, so we're talking about a very long parenthesis here now. Relatively speaking, I should say, because we are in the middle of a 500-page parenthesis. Yeah, that's where it ends, it looks like. So, do we skip the parentheses and just see how he finishes the paragraph? Or do we learn the parentheses? Let me look at it very quickly. I vote we do the parentheses, because even though sometimes it's nice for the flow to see how it flows afterwards, I think here it shouldn't be too confusing. Okay. So, my friends, so we'll do the parentheses. Any questions? Let's stop here for a moment if there's any questions. So the Rebel Hashab now goes further into this discussion in the parentheses. It seems to me he wants to clarify, because earlier in the previous paragraph, he spoke about the example that that the bitter water, even though it's minimal, still affects the sweet water by weakening it. So it looks like he wants to address that somewhat. Is that this same case by a tzaddik, ain't a gomer? That due to the fact there's a minimal amount of ra, even though it's completely nullified in the presence of the rest of the dominant good, does it have any impact on him? Sounds like he wants to address that. If I'm wrong, I'll correct myself, but just looks like it. So here's what he's going to say. Umemela, now that we've established that it's all due to the overpowering element of the good, overpowering force of good, umemela, and inevitably, or memela, or automatically, or therefore, gam b'chinas hadeiv, also the level of good in this tzaddikim that we're talking about, tzaddik she'eino gomer. Hagam shebet tzaddikim hu b'madrega gavoya v'nailis, even though the goodness of the divine soul, or for that matter, the goodness even of the animal soul, I would say the divine soul, is b'madrega gavoya v'nailis, is in a high and exalted state. M'kol mokim eino kamoi shu be'etzem mahusei mamish. Yeah. So even though you could argue, okay, fine, the evil or the negativity of the animal soul has been nullified, has been subdued, not completely transformed because it's still there in the tzaddik she'eino gomer. But his good, you could say, has not been affected at all by it. So he says, no. Even though it's on a very high and exalted level, it's not how toiv is be'etzem mahusei mamish. Like he said before, like sweetness is sweet, that's sweet on its own and doesn't have any, even one drop of bitter water in it. Shari eina dema, because you can't compare Milas tzaddik she'eino gomer, the quality of a tzaddik that's not complete, the Milas tzaddik gomer, to the quality of a tzaddik that is complete, not only in their ra, gam b'chinas hateiv. Okay, so interestingly, I want to look in the Tanya, but it could be that Rebel Hashab is giving us an explanation in Tanya, because you could argue that the tzaddik gomer and tzaddik she'eino gomer is only different in the way they nullify the evil, the negative. That by the tzaddik gomer it's completely eliminated, and tzaddik she'eino gomer it's bottled b'shishim be'elef, it's nullified in the presence of someone. But the good, they're both completely dedicated to godliness. So he says even the good is also gam b'chinas hateiv. You can't compare the two. The ava rabba b'tainugim, which is the highest level of ava to God. The great love, there's ava zuta, there's ava rabba we learned. Zuta means a smaller love, ava rabba means a very great love. Then there's a higher level in that, b'tainugim. It's not just love, but it's a love with a passion. It's called the love of delights, b'tainugim. Hu madrega tzaddik gomer dafke. That's dafke the tzaddik gomer level. So it's not just a quantitative difference, it's the complete tzaddik gomer is dafke k'moshe kosa b'sefer shel beinim sham, as he writes there in Tanya, chapter 10. So therefore, also the good of the tzaddik she'eino gomer, and most likely he's going to say, because he still has something there, even though it's been nullified, is not quite as it is in its purest, pristine form as it is by the tzaddik gomer, who's defined by ava rabba b'tainugim. That's what he says so far. But the parenthesis continues. And you can see why it's a parenthesis, because it's not so negeya here to the understanding. Here his main focus, he wants to say that the severities, gvuras, are sweetened by chesed, but not eliminated. The parentheses is more of an analysis of Tanya and tzaddik gomer and tzaddik she'eino gomer. So though it's relevant to the concept to explain the difference between the two, but still it's a parenthesis for that reason. That would be my explanation, because it's not the core subject, it's a derivative of it. So now he continues. Elsewhere it's explained, like for example, when you fight a war, So sometimes one of the war tactics and strategies is that you allow yourself to be exposed somewhat and vulnerable to be pursued by the enemy in order to win the battle. In other words, there's two sides fighting a battle. So usually one side hides from the other, conceals itself, and tries to vanquish and destroy the enemy without having to expose themselves. But sometimes one of the tactics will be you want to draw out the enemy. So you'll expose yourself somewhat. You allow yourself even to be pursued. The enemy may think, number one, that they're winning and get overconfident. Number two, you're drawing them out from their hiding. Where are they hiding? So like you'd send someone out to lure them, like a decoy, or lure them in order to win the battle. So you see that you're allowing yourself to engage in the war, be more exposed and more vulnerable. So somewhere else, this is mashal is used. Actually, the mashal is used in Derech Mitzvah Secha, in the mitzvah of, I spoke about it last week on My Life, Chassidus applied, the mitzvah where a kohen, the isser of a kohen not allowed to bring an offering when he's a mum, Baal mum, when he's handicapped. So he uses this example. It's an example from the Alter Rebbe. We'll see where he's going with this. And we find this in Nach, in the story of Yeshua. Gabi Yeshua b'Mechemes Ha'i. So he was a war called Ha'i. Ha'i is like a valley. Yeshua Simon Ches. So I don't remember now.
I was a city.
Oh, it's isn't it? Yeah. Is the name because it's in a valley?
I understand it's a name of a city.
Okay, well, we can look it up. But there, I don't remember the story. I have to look it up. In chapter 8, he gives us the source. That there, clearly there was a tactic used where they expose themselves in order to draw out and lure the enemy. Somebody wants to look it up quickly, great. Or if we had Rav Shleimer here, is a Baki in Nach. The truth is, I should know it because I learned Yeshua we learned. For some reason, I don't remember the details. Okay. I must have not been listening that day in class. Okay. So what is this an example for? So he's going to come now to explain something in this context of the Tzaddik Gomer, Tzaddik Shene Gomer. The Kamoikenu Lamaila. This example, same thing as above. The Shanesim Lahem B'chinas Chitzenis, the Chitzenis B'chdei L'natzchom. That sometimes Kedusha, the domain of holiness, and Eira Lekia, and divine energy, will give a little. Chitzenis the Chitzenis. We'll give like a scrap. We'll give say like, what do you say? Shirayim. Scraps. An edge of an edge. A minimal amount in order to conquer and be victorious over the enemy. And he's going to give an example. He's going to explain. Ukamoi b'dvarim hamutarim legami al pi haTorah. Things that are completely permitted by Torah. For example, eating and drinking. He explains in Tanya. Not only you must eat in order to live. It's completely permissible. It's kosher food. And every possible way it's permitted by the Torah. And yet, it's capable of, and it's still under the domain of Klippas Nega, Tevara, because your taiva of the person, you could indulge in the food. So even though it's kosher food, but the indulgence is called Ra, self-indulgence, for your own personal desire and pleasure. So you're doing something completely permitted. We're not talking about eating something or consuming or taking or being involved in something that's not permissible, that's completely off, the Torah doesn't allow. Here it's mutter, but it could be used in a way that's completely self-indulgent. B'taivas heter, b'achila v'shtia. Like in taivas heter, that you have pleasure and desire and indulgence, heter, in something that's allowed in eating and drinking, ukiyetze. Or something similar, could be sleep, could be taking a walk, it could be many different things that were involved in the affairs of this world that are permitted, but it's being done in a way that is not divine, being done in a self-indulgent or selfish way. In Tanya, he says that then takes that, the sparks of that, and it, for the time being, draws it down into Shalosh Klippos Atmeis. He's not bringing that here. It's not relevant to the point that he wants to make. Here he wants to show, which he's now going to explain, he wants to show that there's some benefit in this. Because you're giving, is going to say now by Tzaddik She'ein Gomer, he's going to say, so Yuchaliyas but Tzaddikim, Lepomim, there could be at times by Tzaddikim, Bedugma Kazeis, Benesinis Achetzenis, Lebe B'chinis Primis Chaz V'Shal. That by Tzaddikim it's possible, a scenario where they don't, God forbid, indulge with a taiva, but they give a little of themselves, not in any real internal way, but externally. Not that it's a full-blown desire or indulgent desire like it could be by not a tzaddik, but it's not completely toward heaven for the sake of heaven, like doing something for health purposes. So it's not l'shem shamayim, it's in order for the person to be healthy. Even though it does say in the Rambam being healthy is also part of serving God, but here he clearly means that it's not the focus on serving, it's the focus just to the person's hungry, their body needs some energy. We're not talking about where that energy is going to be used. So the Rebel Hashab says, Shezeu b'chinas neiga be'etzem. This is what he says in Tanya, in chapter 7, is fundamentally the level of klipas neiga, not kedusha. Kedusha is when you eat the food, like he says there, to sharpen your mind to learn Torah. Or you eat the food to use its energy to do a mitzvah. Here, you're not using it for the negative, but you're also not doing it for a mitzvah. You're doing it for sustaining yourself. So it's considered klipas nega, even by a tzaddik, he says now. So a rasha can do it for mamish taiva, like he says. And bepnimius, he's immersed in it. A tzaddik will never be immersed in indulging in a meal, but he may not have the full, total, divine, 100% focus. Like let's say when you say the ovis, heinan mahamakava, their whole being was purely godliness. Here it's possible that there should be some room, like he said in the example with the battle, they're giving a little room to the other side, to the chitzenius, but only chitzenius of chitzenius, just a little of it is going toward that element. It would be like a tzaddik gomer would not go to sleep ever just because he's tired. It'd be because the Eibishter says that's what you have to do. By a tzaddik gomer, maybe the body is a bit tired, so it may affect him a bit like that. But it's always on the minimal. This is called neiga. This is one way to look at it. The Rebel Hashab is, of course, analyzing this because he wants to understand the toiv within the tzaddik she'ein gomer. So before he said that it's clearly not as powerful as the toiv in the tzaddik gomer. The b'mokem machar is analyzing this element of a tzaddik, clearly a tzaddik she'ein gomer, I would say, who's engaged in a battle and he's giving a little to the other side in order to win the battle. So the Rebbe Hashab said one way to explain it is that it's not l'shem shamayim, it's only l'kiyum aguf. V'yesanira, I'm on top of page 1317 now. V'yesanira, what's more likely in interpreting this is shezeu shepnimis hakavana l'shem shamayim. That this is a state where the pnimis hakavana is really l'shem shamayim. Right now, he said the chitzenius is not l'shem shamayim. He says, no, the pnimius hakavana of him giving a little to the enemy in the case of eating or drinking or something like that, in heter, in a thing that's permissible, the pnimius is l'shem shamayim. only to the naked eye, to another person. On the outside, it appears like he's eating because he has desire in the food. So it's a little subtle difference here. And you see how he's analyzing the differences here. I'm going to explain it more, but let's just continue reading. It's very fascinating. And he gives an example by Yaakov. The Indian Haramoy is the Yaakov. So it says Yaakov behaved in a way he deceived Lavan. Where Lavan accuses Yaakov of saying, my brother has come b'mirma, you've come in a deceptive way. So Rashi says there, because he was dealing with a deceiver, and when you deal with someone that's full of deception, you have to sometimes deceive the deceiver. That's a part of the psychological warfare. But the Rebel Hashab is going to explain it even more. So it appears that Yaakov behaved in a way that was Ramoyas, which you also find by Esav, that he bought off the birthright by giving him Nezid Adoshim, some radish, some beet soup. Or later he dressed up with the garments of Esav to fool Yitzchak to give him the blessings. So how's there? It looks very deceptive, very dishonest. It's explained there on the pasuk in the B'Shem L'Kut Amor Ma'amagid Nishmas Eiden. Mavur Sham sounds to me, B'Malkamacha, that he's referring to before, the place that he's talking about, where he gave the example of the battle, the tactic where you give a little to the enemy. So they bring from the Likutei Amorim, even though it's the name of Tanya also, the Magid has a sefer called Likutei Amorim, the Magid, the Mizritcha Magid, the Alter Rebbe's teacher. So what does it say? The Baha'aleis Machshav Zoras Ba'adam, Hainu bit Tzaddikim. He's talking about Tzaddikim. That a Tzaddik is able to take a negative thought and elevate it. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya says it's not something that we should be doing. No, it's to think something negative in order to elevate it, is only a Tzaddik can do that. So he says like this. The Ba'aleis Machshav Zoras Ba'adam, Hainu bit Tzaddikim. Gam betayva muteres kimomen ukiyetze. Even from a desire that's allowed. For example, a person has desires to make money. The desire to have money. Ukiyetze, or similar. Ze'ahiru, this thought, ultimately, this type of thought is still in the category of Ra. It's obviously very subtle and very minimal, because it's only on an external level. So he's saying the Pnimius HaKavana L'Shem Shemaim. But the Chitzenius, it appears like something, there's some self-interest here, like the Ramoyes of Yaakov that appears, even though its intention was not a negative and selfish one, it was a pure intention, but it appears to be somewhat self-serving or deceptive. So he says this is also called somewhere a level of Ra. So the first way he explained it is that it's on the Chitzenius of Chitzenius. L'kiyam aguf, not l'shem shemayim. Here he's going deeper. Even this chitzenius that appears is also l'shem shemayim, really in the intention of the tzaddik, but it appears to be something not that way, and therefore that already has some achizah, some connection to Ra, where the tzaddik gomer doesn't have that at all. Okay, wait a second, before I continue. So what is he doing here in this parentheses? He's coming to explain that even the toiv, the good of the divine soul of the tzaddik she'ena gomer, the tzaddik that's not complete, because he has still some minimal ra that's been nullified in all the goodness. So number one, he's not like the tzaddik gomer, because tzaddik gomer is avar rabba b'tanugim, and there's nothing at all. There's no ra at all. And the mavur b'makam acher is adding to that we see that he has somewhat, like in the tactics of war, he's giving a little for a good intention, l'shem shemayim. But bottom line, that giving a little to the other side by having some little pleasure, or he says not real pleasure, or some benefit or something that is not pure shem shemayim on the outside at least, is not Teiv Mamish, it's in the category of Ra, by the Tzaddik She'ena Gomer. That's why it's called Tzaddik V'Raloi. That's what he says in Tanya. Why is it called Tzaddik V'Raloi? So then the Gemara, Tzaddik V'Raloi means a tzaddik who doesn't have a successful life, has a difficult life. But Tzaddik V'Raloi by Tanya, we're talking about a Tzaddik Gomer. His Yetzer Hara has been eliminated. But Raloi, the Ra is kofel for bottle, meaning the Ra is like bending over and nullified to the good. It's not completely eliminated. That's how he tights Raloi. Tzaddik v'Teiv Loi, there's no Ra altogether. Teiv is everything, dominates everything. Tzaddik v'Raloi is that the Ra is kofel for bottle. And then he says, and when by this Tzaddik She'ena Gomer, when the love, the divine love of holiness intensifies and magbir love and is stronger than this little Ra on the outside, umizbateles, and it gets nullified, zeu inyan hanitzuach, that's the winning of the battle, shabol kedusha, that comes to the holy domain, yisrin b'yeser seis, an additional and qualitative energy, b'yeser seis, even more intense, because he allowed himself to be exposed to the enemy a bit. So his intention was in order to win, but he allowed himself to be exposed. And that once he achieves what he wants, he wins the war in a way that is even more powerful because it came from the Yisur Ne'er Menachesha, that he comes from the strength that came from a darker place. And that's the example of the battle that he allows himself to be exposed and vulnerable, where the enemy can somewhat hold on to him, but with the goal of winning the battle, not God forbid, losing it. Now the Rebel Hashab continues to explain what does this mean? What does this mean? What exactly is he doing? I mean, are we saying that a Tzaddik She'ena Gomer, or Tzaddik in this case, is actually having a machshava zara? He's intentionally going to have a negative thought in order to conquer to transform the negative? Is that what we're saying? So he explains. V'inyan ha'anocha, again, ha'anocha here refers haniach atzmei, where he places himself in danger, basically. It's someone placing himself in a vulnerable and dangerous situation. That's the mashal that he gave. Manichim es atzmo. So he says, that doesn't mean that he initially begins by thinking negative, bad thoughts, God forbid. What it means is that if, not inevitably, what's the word? And non-deliberately, inadvertently, that's the word. They're pisem, automatically or without effort, suddenly, he has a thought that's a negative thought. Al yipel libe mezeh. His heart should not become depressed by it. So we're not talking about that he's going deliberately. Like in the mashal, it's deliberate. You're going and allowing yourself to be exposed to some danger with all the good intentions and ultimately vanquishing them. Here he's saying, no, he's not doing that. But on the other hand, what's happening here is that if a thought like that enters, what happens is he doesn't suddenly get depressed and say, hey, I'm middle of davening, look what kind of thought I just had. What he'll do is he'll overpower and say, even though now I've been exposed somewhat to the enemy, not deliberately, inadvertently, what will I do? I'll bring in even more power, the Rebel Hashab, in order to vanquish this enemy that has been exposed now into my life. That's what he's saying.
It still sounds like it sounds like a pain to me. Maybe I'm not getting it.
Well, let's finish it and then we'll discuss it and we'll look it up and we'll see. Abeni is told. Okay, we'll talk about it. Let me continue reading here. The question is how far I read. I see it's 11:30 after. Okay. He's going to make it very clear soon that only tzaddikim can do this. So Just be patient. Okay, I'll read on. Let me see how far we can get here. Let's see, maybe we can get it. So he says like this. Vayideshem is bainanba. And when this person, through contemplating on this, eich lahaloisa, so here this thought, this negative thought has entered. Now he's contemplating how to elevate it. When he's doing that, it's like a misavik manuval. It's like someone wrestling with a despicable, with a manuval. A manuval is a despicable person. The expression is al tisavik manuval. So you shouldn't become manuval kamese, misnavel kamese. That a person, or hamisavik manuval, misnavel kamese. When a person gets like, you ever feel that when you start arguing or debating somebody that's a despicable person, you feel polluted, you feel like dirtied by it, even if you can win, you don't want to go into it. Why do I have to go into the mud with somebody? So there's an expression, Amasavik manuval misnavel kamese. It's like going down into the mud with somebody that's a despicable person. Even if you have good intentions, you get polluted, you get dirtied by it. You get another word for manuval is a sleaze bag in the modern lingo. Okay, so he says like this. So when a person contemplates how to elevate such a negative thought, he becomes also polluted and despicable by battling with him, by wrestling with him. Because when you wrestle with someone, there's some of the nitzuach hamenuvel, some of the victorious side of your enemy, of the despicable one, is involved in it. It's like when Yaakov was wrestling with the angel, even though he prevailed, but he got wounded in the process because you're engaging with him. As soon as you engage, you may prevail, like we said, the sweet waters may prevail, but something bitter will remain. So temporarily. Only thing, it's very, very subtle. It's very subtle. So he's engaging with it, and there's something that some of the dust of this maneuver gets stuck to you for at least for a while. Very subtle. And ultimately he does win and the battle. So even though he's allowed himself to engage, like he says, not deliberately went there. Once a thought like that came to him, he allows the engagement with the goal of ultimately winning. Now he makes it very clear. Not every person can battle in this type of fashion and have victory. So not everybody can use this tactic, because it's possible he could also fall and lose. And that's why Valkain Ama Oretz Osur Lechel Basar. That's why it says Ama Oretz literally means the nation from the earth, an earthy person, meaning someone who does not know Torah, is not a Talmid Chacham, is not allowed to eat meat, because meat requires birur. Eating vegetables, the sparks are not that trapped. You don't need such a heavy digestion and heavy freeing of the sparks in the food, even kosher meat. But meat has a lot of power, and you need strength to be mavar. So going there, you're going down a level. That's why before the Mabul, the flood, Adam and Chava and the generations were not allowed to eat meat. They were vegetarians because they couldn't go down to that place. That place requires a lot of work to free the sparks in killing an animal and then redeeming the sparks. After the Mabul, we have the strength to do that, but it doesn't mean we don't get polluted by it. We go down to the meat means you're affected by that type of eating. So namoritz also lechel basar. So you see clearly not everybody is able to go down to that level of battle. But only in the level of tzaddikim, of the righteous, can be a victory in this manner where you're allowing some of the enemy in order to win the battle. Shetchilasa hi bedakas ma'ed. that in the beginning it's in a very subtle way. Like we say, it's not overt taivas, pleasure, or negative thoughts. It's very subtle, but something is there. And the end of the story is that there's a victory, and Yisr Ner, an additional oir is added because you were able to vanquish the enemy while engaging with it. And nevertheless, says the Rebel Hashab, we can say the zeh b'madreges tzaddik she'eina gomer. This is the level of a tzaddik she'eina gomer. Aval b'madreges tzaddikim gemurim eina shayach hanocha klal. Like tzaddikim gemurim, it's not possible. This tactic is only someone that is capable of allowing the enemy in. By tzaddik gomer, it's not possible. This type of allowing himself to be exposed. That's explained in this topic earlier. In this, in the above mentioned topic, in the name of the Eitz Chaim, Shara Oros Hamechem Peri Gimel. So there's a gate called Oros Hamechem, chapter 3. That Kasher Malchus Mikabeles Mibchinas Pele Elyon. That when Malchus receives from Keser Pele Elyon, the supernal wonder, on the highest levels, Oz Ein Mokim V'Sherish Klal V'Klal Yinikas Achitzenim. Then there's no room and no root at all. What's the word we say? Completely, like when you say no to someone, but it's like an absolute no. There's a word in English. I forgot the word. Anyway, klal, there's no room or source unequivocally at all. The yanikas achitzenim, for the outer negative forces to nurse any energy, gam le mebchinas halavushim, not even from the outer garments. So this is what is compared to tzaddik gomer. There's no room altogether. So this tactic doesn't work there. It's not applicable there. Ukasha malchus b'chinas elikim, but when malchus is in the state of elikim, which means somewhat concealed, the ksiv melech elikim, oz yochelias ein ezi yanikim b'chinas achitzenis. Then the malchus, then there can be some yanika, some nursing, some drawing out some energy from the outer dimension of malchus. And based on this, we can say that the level of complete utter tzaddikim, where there's absolutely no room for all of this, their avodah is ava b'tainugim, like we said before, love, great love, with pleasures and delights. There's no possibility of any grasp and any hanocha that they somewhat give a little for the negative in order to draw them out. The efsher, the mashakosa b'sefer shabenik perek chavches, and we could say efsher is it possible. Rebel Hashab is saying that what it says in Tanya chapter 28, be'in halos hamidas shel hamachshava zoros, about elevating the midas of these negative thoughts, who gam b'tzadikim gemurim. That is possible also by tzaddikim gemurim. It explains because it's not their own negative thoughts. The thoughts that come to them are thoughts from somebody else. It's like a Rebbe who heard from someone a negative thought. It's not his own thoughts. That doesn't affect him in any way, impact him. Not even in a minimal way, like by a tzaddik she'eina gomer. And the elevation of that negative thought is not through a wrestling and a battle, like it is by the tzaddik she'eina gomer. Rather, it's repaired and elevates on its own. That due to his work, by revealing the core divine in his spirit, in his Aveda of this great love with pleasure and delights, automatically eliminates any of the negative. It's not through battle at all. So that's the tzaddik gomer. The tzaddik she'eina gomer, there's a battle but it's a very subtle battle because he's winning and he's just allowing a little of the negative in order to vanquish it. And by Beinoni, it's none of that. A Beinoni has the battle all the time between the animal soul and the divine soul, and is not even allowed to go into this place. Not allowed. Beinoni should never say, I'll let a little of the enemy in for me to elevate it. By Beinoni, it has to be total control. There's animal soul, divine soul. Make sure moyach shalat al alev, the mind controls the heart. Don't let the animal soul, even though you have negative thoughts that are inadvertent, control them. Don't let them affect your deliberate thoughts, your speech, and your action. So in a Beinoni, it's completely on the expression level of his garments, of his expressions. In a Tzaddik, chain of Gomer, the animal soul's faculties have been subdued and are in control, but there's some minimal. And there, he allows in something in order to vanquish it. And by Tzaddik Gomer, he's completely above it all. And everything is done completely from the top down, meaning you bring in so much light, it automatically eliminates any negative thoughts from others that don't affect him in any personal, individual way. That's what the Rebel Hashab said in this parenthesis. So you see why it's a parenthesis, because it's not the core subject, but it does touch upon the idea of goodness and negative, but the goodness is dominating. So in the Tzaddik Shein Gomer, it's still not full transformation. The Tzaddik Gomer sounds very much like there is no Cheshach altogether. But we'll learn about that, I'm sure, because he said Kamoshi is boyer that by Tzaddik Gomer. So that concludes. I'll stop here, this class. I'll take any questions and then we'll resume tomorrow. Any questions? I think it's quite clear. I mean, it needs to be reviewed and thought through, but
I looked up the battle of Ai, and it says here that he took about 5,000 men and let them lie in ambush between Beit El and Ai. And then the people saw that, and it was when the king of Ai saw, they hastened and rose up early, and the men of the city went out against Israel to battle. He drew them up, he and all his people, at a time appointed before the plain. But he did not know there was an ambush against him behind the city. And Yeshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten before them and fled by the way of the desert. And all the people that were in Ai were called together to pursue them. And they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. And there was not a man left in Ai or in Beit El. They're all running after Yeshua. And the Lord said to Yeshua, go out there. And he went, and they all went in the city. The point is, when they went in the city, there was no men in the city there, and they burnt it to the ground. And when the king of Ai and his soldiers saw that it was being burnt to the ground, they turned around, but then they were already caught between. Joshua's men turned around on them, so they were caught in the between, and they killed everybody.
Okay, there you go. So does he translate Ai as a city, or does he say what Ai means there?
Ai is a city. City.
Does it say
it's
why
a city.
It's called Ai? Okay, fine.
Well, it's a city because I looked it up as well, and they found it on a mound on a higher level, so it can't be a valley.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, good. Very good. Thank you so much. That's very good.
So the
I need to
difference there,
sign off now because I have to do doing now a 2-hour seminar online, which you could see, by the way, if you like. I don't know if you.
Where do we find that? You'll post it?
I'll send it. I'll send the link right now. It starts at 12. So let me just say. So I stop here by the end of the parentheses, down more than half down the page 1317. We'll review it again tomorrow, and we'll sign off now. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Great Pesach Sheni, which means it's never far found, never too late.
Second chances.